For 18 years, I'd been among a very select group of U.S. citizens permitted to travel to Cuba. As an American journalist, I wasn't bound by the travel ban, which kept my countrymen away from this, our closest overseas neighbor. What was Cuba really like, friends would ask. I tried my best to explain, but couldn't. When it came to Cuba, things often seemed complicated because they were complicated. I did 4 documentaries on Cuban music and culture, and one which dealt with U.S.-Cuba relations since the revolution.
On one of my first visits to Cuba, I met the Peanut Man, an independent businessman in what I'd been told was a strict communist state.
I marched with hundreds of thousands in massive protests of American government policies and worked with a dissident who had left the island but returned to his homeland to try to improve relations.
It's incredible to be here, to see that all these people, because they still love Fidel, many of them. They have tears in their eyes. I'm a dissident. I'm a political dissident, but I hold the flag high because most of all, I'm a Cuban.
But although people found my stories interesting, I never thought I could fully explain what was happening because my fellow citizens couldn't go and see for themselves. See for themselves that we've been lied to about Cuba for half a century. In 2013, I organized a trip through Veterans for Peace and brought 18 members and associates on a 1-week tour of Havana. The trip proved a success and I was asked to do it again. In early 2015, the new trip was booked and we were ready to go when suddenly everything we'd known about U.S.-Cuba relations changed.
Good afternoon. Today, the United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba. In the most significant changes in our policy in more than 50 years, we will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests, and instead, we will begin to normalize relations between our two countries.
Resultado de un diálogo al más alto nivel que incluyó una conversación telefónica que sostuve ayer con el presidente Barack Obama, se ha podido avanzar en la solución de algunos temas de interés para ambas naciones.
Through these changes, we intend to create more opportunities for the American and Cuban people and begin a new chapter among the nations of the Americas.
Hemos acordado el restablecimiento de las relaciones diplomáticas. Esta decisión del presidente Obama merece el respeto y reconocimiento de nuestro pueblo.
Purely by accident, our tour landed in Havana the day the new rules began to take effect. In the plazas of the old city, there was a new mood. Our group was surrounded by media, with NBC News getting the impressions of our first-time visitors. An Associated Press photographer snapped a shot of VFP member John Kaler from Wisconsin, which went worldwide, and John became the iconic face of American travel to Cuba.
For myself, it was more about finding out about what is really going on in Cuba, without the hype, and talking directly to the people. And on this trip, we talked to people in education, we talked to former soldiers that were in the revolution, we went to art museums, we saw dance studios. It was just a remarkable time that we really got to see a lot of the culture.
Lázaro Salcida makes art by recycling wire and paper and teaches local children in his home studio right on the streets of Havana. The Committees for the Defense of the Revolution are neighborhood watch groups. They were especially important in the first years of the new government when the CIA was sending spies into Cuba to try to foment a counter-revolution. The CDRs were credited with helping to prevent an overthrow of the new government. Outside of Havana, the countryside reverts to its agrarian roots.
I'm so blown away by the architecture here. As far as safety, we've never had a problem. It's really been a very pleasant experience.
The country is surrounded by some of the most beautiful beaches in the world. Although Americans can see them, we're still not allowed to vacation in Cuba.
We went to a farm where we saw that everything was organic, and they're doing very, very well. And in all of the agricultural products here in Cuba, there's nothing added, no chemicals and that kind of thing. I think we could not only help them on their their opportunity here to build their economy and society, but we could also learn some wonderful things from them as well.
Ernest Miller Hemingway was born in Chicago, but made Finca Vejia, a few miles south of Havana, his home for some 20 years, longer than he lived anywhere else in this world. For a writer, it gave him a sense of place where he could get away from being an international celebrity, and after Hemingway gave the whole place to the Cuban government, the villa is maintained as though Papa may have just left the house for an afternoon of marlin fishing in the nearby Gulf Stream. Caretakers treat it with a reverence that's almost religious, and his books and papers are cleaned and dusted and put right back where they were.
I love Cuba. It's what I never would have expected anything like what I experienced. I didn't really know a lot about it. I think my history classes in high school, Bay of Pigs, those kinds of things, there were very, very minimal information was given to us about what kind of a culture Cuba had, and it was like nothing I could have ever imagined.
One of the first actions taken by the revolutionary government was to send thousands of city-educated young people into the mountains to teach the campesinos to read. The Cuban love of education and learning is celebrated in this museum, and they proudly have one of the highest literacy rates in the world. World-renowned artist Jose Fuster once again welcomed us to his magical fantasy land of a home. A man of peace, he was very pleased about the new relationship between our countries. Just a few years ago, he was denied a visit to attend the opening of an exhibit of his own work in California because the State Department felt he could be a danger to our country because he would not denounce his government.
What impressed me the most was the joy, the friendliness. They didn't have a lot, but they were all so happy and comfortable. They were all right with that. Like, there didn't seem to be people weren't complaining about how difficult it is. They just went out and had a good time. They were genuinely friendly and genuinely happy to meet you.
We talked with ordinary working men and women who were very positive about the thaw in relations between our countries. We also met with our fellow military vets who discussed their experiences in their military, from the triumph of the revolution to fighting apartheid in Angola. We heard from the head of the Havana Red Cross about the humanitarian missions of Cuban medical personnel. They've sent 125 doctors to Ebola-stricken parts of Africa, quite a contrast to the panic and fear which was spread in the United States by some politicians. One of the biggest questions left unanswered regarding relations between our countries is found in this, one of the most popular songs in Cuban history. It's a story of a woman from a quiet little town where the tropical mountains meet the Caribbean, a beautiful place called Guantanamo. But when you say that name now, a different image comes to mind of a terrible prison where torture techniques were refined and terrorists, and many non-terrorists, are being held indefinitely by our government. Gitmo isn't on anyone's tour schedule as yet, and I couldn't take my people there. But surprisingly, one of them had already been.
In the 1960s, I was a young guy, and I was stationed in 2nd Battalion 8th Marines in Guantanamo Bay. I didn't realize at the time I was taking part of history in the sense that Cuba would be isolated for 50 years from the United States.
But in the 50 years since Dan was there, lots has changed, especially in the past 15 years when Gitmo was turned into an offshore holding area for the War on Terror, a place outside of our laws where messy questions about human rights and our Constitution could be ignored. For Dan, coming back after half a century, it brought up a question.
I had the opportunity to come back with my wife and see that possibly there was a mistake being made over the last 50 years.
With the historic agreement in place, we met with Dr. Manuel Yepes, a Cuban scholar, economist, and ambassador. He praised the re-engagement between our governments and quoted Fidel Castro, who said the revolution will really begin now that the embargo against the Cuban people is finally lifted. But even with the opening of embassies, the positive response to this diplomatic breakthrough, both on the island and in the United States, isn't held by all. The Cuban-American delegation in the United States Congress has denounced the new openings between our countries and promised to overturn the Obama-Castro agreement. But with millions of Americans now visiting the island, encountering nothing but people wanting to be our friends, the lies which have come out of Florida for a half century about what really goes on in Cuba have been shown to be just that, lies. And while Senators Rubio and Cruz claim to know what Cubans on the island think, those who have joined me on my Veterans for Peace tours now know more about what is actually happening on the ground than these two politicians, because neither Rubio nor Cruz were born on the island and have ever been to Cuba. So now is the time for some new history. Our 50-plus years of hostility toward the Cuban government and its people has come to an end. The Cuban Revolution is finally over, as Dr. Yepes told us, and it was won by Fidel and Raul Castro and their supporters. So it's time we end the embargo, close the notorious prison camp, and let Guantanamo revert to the beautiful tropical paradise it actually is.
Went down to Havana, but please don't touch Monte Pico, Iba just like me there. The socialistas, they ain't so bad. The Cuban women, they drive you mad. That's why I gotta go back. Got to go back. Got to go back down to Cuba. Gotta go back. Got to go back. Got to go back down to Cuba. Went down to Havana, yeah, sure was fun. Heard some Cuban music, drank some Cuban rum. The Cuban coffee, they make it strong. The Cubans sing my Cuban song. That's why I gotta go back.